Understanding Power, The Indispensable Chomsky, 2002, is a compilation of discussions and lectures by Noam Chomsky, edited by Peter R. Mitchell and John Skeffel. This work is not structured as a conventional book, but as a series of dialogues, where Chomsky addresses a variety of issues concerning power, politics, media, and social control. The book offers insights into Chomsky's critique of state power and the role of intellectuals in society, emphasizing the need for activism to counter hegemonic forces. Here's a detailed note on the major themes discussed in Understanding Power. Chomsky begins by dissecting the mechanisms by which media in democratic societies are used to manipulate public opinion. He builds on his propaganda model, From Manufacturing Consent, co-authored with Edward Herman, which posits that media outlets, rather than being independent, serve the interests of elite groups, corporations, governments, and powerful individuals. Chomsky argues that the media function as a tool of control, shaping the perceptions of citizens to maintain the status quo. This model emphasizes how news is filtered and censored, and how corporate ownership influences what information is made public. The media, according to Chomsky, works not by explicit coercion, but by framing the world in a way that limits alternative viewpoints. He refers to this process as thought control in democratic societies, highlighting that it is subtler, but just as powerful as propaganda in authoritarian regimes. Chomsky devotes significant attention to the responsibility of intellectuals in society, often referencing the historical role they've played in supporting systems of power. He argues that intellectuals, especially in the West, are complicit in perpetuating state violence and inequality. This complicity stems from their proximity to power structures, be it through academia, journalism, or think tanks. Chomsky critiques what he calls the technocratic elite, who work to justify policies that favor the ruling class, even when such policies result in suffering for the majority. He asserts that intellectuals should instead use their privileged position to expose the injustices perpetrated by their governments, criticizing figures who remain silent or actively support imperialistic actions. Chomsky contrasts this with what he considers the moral obligation of intellectuals to challenge power and stand in solidarity with the oppressed. He praises those who step outside the bounds of institutional protection to critique their own governments. A recurring theme in Understanding Power is Chomsky's vehement critique of U.S. foreign policy, which he describes as imperialistic and driven by economic interests, rather than humanitarian concerns. Chomsky traces a history of U.S. interventions, particularly in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East, where the U.S. has supported oppressive regimes, orchestrated coups, or directly invaded countries under the guise of promoting democracy. He argues that U.S. foreign policy has always been primarily concerned with maintaining control over global resources and markets. Chomsky refutes the idea that U.S. interventions are motivated by the spread of freedom or democratic values, pointing out that the U.S. often supports dictatorships when it serves economic or strategic interests. He provides historical examples, such as the Vietnam War, the overthrow of the democratically elected government in Chile, and the support of authoritarian regimes in the Middle East. Chomsky's analysis points to the underlying continuity in U.S. foreign policy, regardless of which political party is in power. He argues that the bipartisan consensus on key issues, such as support for military intervention and neoliberal economic policies, illustrates how democracy in the U.S. is limited to a narrow spectrum of interests, primarily those of the elite. Chomsky provides a thorough critique of neoliberalism, which he defines as a political project aimed at consolidating wealth and power in the hands of a few. He highlights how neoliberal policies, such as deregulation, privatization, and austerity, have led to increasing inequality, environmental degradation, and the erosion of democratic institutions. In Understanding Power, Chomsky traces the roots of neoliberalism to the rise of corporate power in the 20th century, arguing that this system has been institutionalized through international organizations like the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Trade Organization, WTO. These institutions, according to Chomsky, enforce policies that prioritize corporate profit over social welfare, often leading to the destabilization of economies in the Global South. Chomsky is particularly critical of the U.S. government's role in promoting neoliberalism abroad, where free market reforms are imposed on developing countries as a condition for receiving loans or aid. He describes this as a form of economic imperialism, where countries are forced to open their markets to foreign capital at the expense of their own development. Despite his grim assessment of power structures, Chomsky maintains a hopeful outlook on the possibility of social change through activism. He argues that grassroots movements have been historically responsible for achieving significant reforms, from civil rights to labor rights to anti-colonial struggles. Chomsky emphasizes that change doesn't come from the top down, but from the efforts of ordinary people organizing collectively to challenge power. In this section, Chomsky provides a pragmatic view of activism. He acknowledges the limits of protest, but encourages sustained engagement, arguing that even small acts of resistance can contribute to larger social movements. He also stresses the importance of education, urging people to become informed about the world beyond mainstream media narratives. Chomsky criticizes the modern education system for failing to foster critical thinking. Instead of promoting inquiry and intellectual independence, he argues that educational institutions often serve as training grounds for conformity, where students are encouraged to accept dominant ideologies without question. Chomsky believes that true education should inspire individuals to challenge authority and think critically about the information they are given. He also touches on the importance of alternative media and independent scholarship in fostering a more informed and critically engaged public. Chomsky himself has been a major proponent of alternative media as a means of countering the distortions of mainstream news outlets. Although not the central focus, Understanding Power also touches on the environmental crisis, which Chomsky links to corporate greed and state complicity. He argues that environmental destruction is a direct result of the capitalist pursuit of profit, which prioritizes short-term gains over long-term sustainability. Chomsky criticizes governments and corporations for ignoring the scientific consensus on issues like climate change, pointing to the devastating consequences for the planet and future generations.